Coming to you from our studio in the Motor Valley of Europe, Stuttgart, Germany, this is the Screens Podcast, your source for automotive and technology discussion. I'm your host, Matt Sigers. Joining me today, you can see him on the official Screens YouTube channel show Experts in Cars, our UX consultant and HMI expert, Srivas.
Hello.
Srivas. No last name.
It's like Madonna.
It's like Madonna. Yeah. Running this show behind the console, the maestro Tom Zimmerman. Our guest today is Head of Product Management, Genesis Motor Europe, Dominik Kling. Dominik, thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having the chance to join this. I'm excited. It's actually my first podcast, so this is a premiere.
Oh, good. I think it's Srivas's first.
My first one as well.
Yeah. I've done a couple of these now. It doesn't mean I'm good at it. It just means that I've done them. So there's that. Cool. So let's get right into it. You work for Genesis Motor Europe. It's cool because Genesis is one of those luxury brands that I'm actually familiar with. I'm never super familiar with a ton of cars. Srivas is definitely the expert when it comes to cars, which is why he's on our show, Experts in Cars.
Yep. I'm going to quickly bring the conversation towards you, Dominik. So you are a self-proclaimed car guy. You know, I saw this on your profile. So my question to you is, what makes you a car guy, and what is it about cars that ignites that passion in you?
Oh, well, I have to start very early on that one. So when I was a kid, I was always drawing cars, obviously in a not very good way, but actually I was excited about the design of cars. And when I was in elementary school, I actually wanted to become a car designer. Then my skills were probably in that area were not good enough, but nevertheless, I kept the passion for cars. Also, I'm a kid of the 90s, so growing up in the 90s, there was the famous Michael Schumacher time. So I was very excited about Formula One, and this kind of draw my attention to the car industry. And then when I finished school, when I started my studies, actually, I learned that I like this transition between technology and also marketing the technology. That's also how I came up with my studies, having half of a marketing degree and having half of a mechanical engineering degree. And then when it came to choosing a job, choosing a company, for me was always clear that I would like to have a job in the car industry, which is still one of the, let's say for me, most emotional products you can buy as a person in your life. So probably the biggest decision in your life is whom to marry, then to buy a flat, to buy a house. But then from a price perspective, let's say, probably the car is one of the most important things still for a person to purchase and to own. And that's what I like about the product. And then there is so many different ways of approaching a car. For some people, it's just going from A to B. For some people, it's expressing themselves. And then you have all in between. And the industry was going into a direction where they tried to address all of those different needs. And as I'm evolving myself within the years from becoming, let's say, adult for getting an experienced person in the automotive industry, also my personal taste, of course, is evolving. But what I always liked is to have nice things, to have premium things. And that's how I ended up being head of product management in a premium brand. And this is somehow something I really appreciate because it's fitting also my personal lifestyle.
I think right around 2015, I think it was 2015, I actually had the Hyundai Genesis Coupe before it was the Genesis brand. And I absolutely loved that car. I think the one that I had was just I think it was a 4-cylinder, and it had like the 2.0 turbo in it or something like that. But it was crazy because it was a Hyundai. And people would get in that car and they'd be like, this is a Hyundai? This is so sharp. It looks so expensive. It looks like some kind of crazy luxury thing. And I'm like, yeah, I can't believe it. And they would always be so surprised at the acceleration that it hit despite being a 4-cylinder. They would be amazed at the interior, the HMI and all of that. And I think that what ended up happening was Genesis broke off into the luxury brand, away from being a Hyundai Genesis into Genesis being the brand itself shortly after that. And to me, when I see Genesis, I always think this is the most, I'm a big fan. Like, I think that it's the most bang for your buck you can get in a luxury vehicle. Like, it's for the price point and the amount of things you get, the value is just insane. So let's get with the questions. So where does Genesis stand right now, like in the portfolio of the Hyundai group of companies in terms of its philosophy?
I mean, yeah, you mentioned right. We obviously positioned ourselves as the premium or luxury brand, as you call it, of the Hyundai Motor Group universe. And that's also the aim to strengthen this kind of approach. So we have launched the brand obviously with a full lineup of premium cars, starting from the D segment up to the E segment. And then last year having our GB60 as the smallest car joining the lineup in the C SUV area. So also trying to get a part of the cake in this specific segment, which is right now one of the most growing segments in the European market, also on the premium market. And obviously for us, it's also important to have this kind of segment filled up with a competitive product, as this is also the gateway for the customers entering a premium brand. And as we are still the new kid on the block, for us it's quite important to do conquest, because as you might know, in Europe we are quite suspicious regarding Asian luxury brands. So that's a big challenge we are facing, but therefore we need to have competitive products starting from the smaller segments up to the higher segments, in being able to conquer also customers from those areas that are evolving into the premium segment actually.
I know that you also have experience working, I think it was Great Wall Motor, it was a Chinese company, correct? So you've got experience basically working for two Asian companies. One was Chinese manufacturer, that's Korean for Hyundai and Genesis. How do they differ in their approach to building cars? Do you find that they differ in any way?
They are different. The approach is also, to a certain extent, it's similar, but nevertheless, it's quite different. I think what Korea understood, and that's obviously shown in the fact that they are on the market much longer than the Chinese companies, especially having thought about global expansion. So Genesis, Hyundai, Kia, they are much more, let's say, right now already tackling the needs of different regions, whereas the Chinese, it's the first generation of cars that is supposed to come to global markets. And you can clearly see it in the way they are working, the way the products are defined, that still the major market is probably the Chinese market. And now they are trying to get also a bit of empowerment in the European market. So what we always tended to say, especially also in Great Wall, so Europe is the battlefield of premium. Europe is the, let's say, the birth country or the birth region of the car industry itself. So that's why also it's important for a Chinese OEM to come here to prove themselves and to say, even in the domestic market, look, we made it in Europe, and that's the way we see the things. But nevertheless, the approach is still very much, let's say, concentrated on the domestic market, is my feeling. And they are trying to bring those products to the European market with little changes, with, in a certain way, less feeling for the other region.
So getting back to that point, I think you already talked about, you being a car guy and the different things that people see in vehicles. Where do you see the future of mobility kind of headed towards?
That's a very wide question, and also a very wide and wild question. I think what we are in general facing right now is one of the most exciting times in the last 100 years of the automotive industry. We are not only facing, let's say, a change of going from new mobility needs to different kind of mobility scenarios, but also let's say, the essential part of the automotive industry, the car itself, is going through an essential change. So we are moving from ICE engines to battery electric vehicles. And I think that's a quite important transition phase, but also very exciting transition phase. In a certain way, what Shriva said is let's say, going back to point zero, right? So all the OEMs were developing cars since 150 years, and they were basically working on one technology to improve it generation by generation. But now, to a certain extent, we are starting at a point zero, and we can see it that right now all the electric cars on the market, they still have a lot of downsides compared to a traditional ICE car.
Yeah, I think the other point in this regard is that there's been more development in the space in the last 10 years than there's been in the last 40 years, I think. I mean, electric cars are as old as, I don't know, a century. If you go to the Porsche Museum, you see that.
Right.
But it never took off. I think in the last 10 years, there's certainly been a revolution in that regard.
I think there has to be. At this
Yeah.
point, we're kind of forced to go that way.
I mean, I'm personally a hydrogen enthusiast, but yeah. Coming back into the talk of luxury, it's very interesting, your journey, because I have a very similar journey. I also grew up watching Michael Schumacher, and then I studied mechanical engineering, went into user experience design, and today I'm in an automotive based company. So it's glad to know I'm not the only one sharing this journey. But I have very similar values as you, to have the nice things. And on that point, in the course of creating a luxury brand, that is affordable to people, where does Genesis stand currently in this journey?
Let me quickly think about how to define or how to react to the question. I mean, obviously, it's a very interesting question and also very challenging to answer, to be honest. Because what I said in the start is actually one of the key factors for us being also in the European market is it's quite challenging coming here to the hometown. And you said it in the start also, Matt. You're coming from Stuttgart, the hometown of Mercedes, of Porsche, but then we have Audi, we have BMW. So basically, when you talk about luxury brands, you talk about German brands. And that's one of the most challenging things you can probably face as a premium manufacturer, to go to this market, to challenge the established players, but also to challenge the mindset of the people. Because it's not only about delivering what matters to those customers, but you have to over-exceed those expectations. And as you also said, the industry is going through an essential change. And I think it's not only anymore about the product, but it's about the experience beyond the product. And I think that's where also the Genesis approach is kicking in. So we can not only define ourselves by the product itself. Of course, we are trying to do that. And for example, we are trying to be the best equipped car in every segment, to give an additional benefit, an additional value to our customers. But on the other hand, what we are following in Genesis is this kind of approach of hospitality. So to taking the experience of owning a car to the next level, and also making the everyday, let's say, life and the everyday handling of the car for our customers much simpler. And I think that's the way we see ourselves, and that's the way we try to position ourselves in the market, to make the handling of the car and how to deal with the service, all those kind of pain points the customers are having, to deal with those kind of things in a much simpler way, in a more effortless way. And I think that's one of the key factors we are trying to achieve in the European market. And what we see right now from the first customers, obviously the base is still quite small, but that those customers that had experience with a lot of premium brands from the Germans, but then also trying maybe some UK or Japanese brands in the market, what we get as a feedback is actually that they appreciate the kind of effort we are putting into the experience, into the ownership of the car. And this is something that sets us apart from the competition.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially when it comes to branding. I think that, like you said, you're very young as a luxury brand, and I always think of shoes. I know it sounds weird to talk about cars and shoes, but I think back in the early '80s, like the main shoe people, at least in the United States where I'm from, is, it was like Converse and Adidas, and Nike was way down, and they were kind of known as a running shoe company. and they really just had their product was super high quality, and it gave a lot of value. It's just trying to get people to recognize that at first, because you're kind of the new kid on the block. And I always look at Genesis as like that, like, you know, eventually people are going to start to really see these things, but right now it's so young. In terms of HMI, which we do here a lot, what's your like design philosophy? What's Genesis's design philosophy? How does it tie in with the philosophy of like the other Hyundai sister brand?
Well, first of all, I think you have to see the HMI as a thing that is not only regarding the screens, regarding the infotainment. You have to see it as an overall concept of how this is integrated into the interior design of the car. So I think even nowadays the interior of a car is getting more and more important. We spend more time in the inside of a car. The attention on the street to a certain extent can be less because of all the ADAS features we have inside the car. So there is now also the path to level 3. So I think the attention on details on the car is getting more and more important on the inside of the car. And then the HMI obviously have to fit those kind of needs that the customer has nowadays to a car. It has to fit the everyday need of a everyday drive to the office, but then also fitting to your needs when you have longer journeys on business trips, on vacation, those kind of things. And the HMI in a certain way has to serve the customer and not the different way around. And I think that's also an important thing behind the philosophy in Genesis. So overall, the design on the interior is following the approach of the beauty of white space, we call it. And this is something that is coming from Korean architecture, that is saying you need to have the perfect functionality combined still with enough space so that the architecture and the design itself can live the life, or can promote itself, let's say, in a certain way. And this is something that is also embedded into our HMI. So we are trying to do everything as easy as possible. And this is also including, for example, that we are not going to a full touch experience. So what we see is that especially for functions that are used while driving the car, the seat heating, the steering wheel heating, the climate control, all those kind of things, the customer still would like to have a physical button to control it in a certain way blind, to not be distracted from the street, to approach the customers in a way they are used to everyday devices like their smartphones, like an iPad, and so on and so on. But on the other hand, what we can see is still also the target audience of car industry is quite old to a certain extent. And that's why you still need to keep some of the basic elements as physical buttons. And this is something we are trying to achieve in keeping, for example, the buttons for the seat heating, the steering wheel heating, the ventilation for the seats, the climate knobs, and all those kind of things that you would also actually like to approach very actively and quite often while driving without getting disturbed from the screen itself. And that's why there needs to be a harmony between the modern infotainment system and those, let's say, more classical buttons inside a car. But I think overall, this in the end is giving you this fantastic customer experience that is actually giving you a benefit to use a car in an everyday life.
I agree. I mean, it's weird. Like, I do like the physical buttons, like on certain things, right? I think that you're going to be proven completely right with this design philosophy, because, you know, I don't want to call myself old. Like, I'm not young. Shrivas is old at heart. So I'm sure you also love physical buttons, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of follow-up questions as well, you know, because I'm a big proponent of physical buttons, because I think although we are very ambitious in, automated driving, we are not there yet. We are still driving our own cars, and the cars may park themselves, I don't know, have some automated cruise control, or like certain brands claim overinflate their self-driving abilities. I think we are still driving our own cars. And today I'm seeing a trend of full touchscreen infotainment systems. There are German OEMs, American OEMs doing these end-to-end touchscreens. Dominik, what is your thought on these kind of full touchscreen systems? Do you think they are being implemented with a sense of future in mind, or do you think it still makes sense to continue going with the physical controls as you're doing?
That's a good question.
So I cannot speak for the company on that behalf. I will talk more on my, let's say, personal experience, how I see the things, and for me, it's definitely not a way to go to a full touchscreen experience, because as you said, Shrivas, first of all, we are not there yet driving fully autonomous, and on the other hand, the question is if we always want to get there, because as we said in the start, look, we are still people that like driving cars. We are still, let's say, somehow emotionally attached to our cars. And of course, there is a big part of the population that is seeing the car as a commuter from going from A to B. But there is also still a big part of the population, and especially when you go up in the segments, when you go up in the, let's say, level of cars, so from mainstream, low cost to premium, on the premium segments, you still have a lot of people that are emotional with their cars. They still would like to drive the cars by themselves. And I'm a person myself. To a certain extent, I like ADAS features, and especially when I'm driving in countries with a speed limit, I like also using the ADAS systems from time to time. But especially in Germany on the highway, but also in Croatia. For example, my wife is Croatian and they have some beautiful streets on the ocean side. I like to drive myself. I don't want an ADAS to disturb me driving. I want to have the cornering. I want to have these emotions from driving a car. And I think to this extent, a touchscreen is just disturbing. And in any case, I'm not using the touchscreen while driving. So for me, the main purpose is to inform me in a good way, but to keep the kind of controls in my hands and to have this kind of controls that I need on a regular basis. I need to control blind. If I drive the car for 1, 2, 3 months, I need to know where do I activate, where do I control my infotainment, where do I zoom in on the navigation. I need to know it by heart and I need to do it blind. And then for me, beside having the big screen on the center, for me, what becomes much more important is actually the thing that is in front of the driver. So I think talking about head-up display, how to display the information on the street, how to guide the driver in a much more efficient way without disturbing him. This is, I think, a topic that is much more important to me than having a bigger screen on the center console.
And I think that's the best possible answer you could have given to my car guy question. You've just proven yourself to be a car guy.
Definitely a car guy when it comes to that. Yeah.
But, I want to take a step back quickly because when we were discussing about the course of creating a luxury brand, you had a very interesting point, Dominik, that, Europe is the battleground of the premium vehicles, As someone who's been in Europe for a while now, I have had my observations. I think Asian brands, I'm going to stick in this case to Hyundai and Kia, have very significantly penetrated the entry-level cars, the small hatchbacks, the mid-size SUVs, and so on. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to, of course, luxury cars, right? Of course, when you speak to the Europeans, their idea of a luxury car is European, like you said. And what I believe entails in building such a brand is building trust. And trust is, of course, the user trusts the car and, they trust the brand. So in your view, what are some steps that have to be taken to build this trust between the vehicle and the brand and the user? And I ask this also from a UX perspective because, only when you trust the car and the system, you're really, in your element in the car. So similarly, how do you build that trust as a brand with people?
Quite challenging. Let me think about a good answer. I mean, trust is always a thing, I think, personally, that comes with time. If you think about your private life, if you think about also work relationships, what comes with, or when trust comes in, it's always a matter of time. So I think that's one of the most important things. So we have to show, as a young brand, we have to show our commitment to the market, to be on the market for a certain amount of time, to start having also the cars in an everyday situation, to see it in traffic conditions, to see it from people also that are not working with Genesis, that didn't hear about the brand before. And I think this will take time. It will just take time to build up this trust, to see also the car in everyday life. And I think it's not only about trust,
Exactly.
but it's also about getting familiar, to a certain extent, getting confident with the brand.
Yeah, of
Because in Europe, it's still very much a culture, what we see, of justification, so to a certain extent. So you will always need to justify yourself in front of your neighbor. Why did you buy a Genesis instead of a BMW? Why did you buy this instead of a Mercedes? And this is something that we Europeans, we don't necessarily like this kind of conversations. And this is something we have to overcome to build up trust. But this obviously will only come with time, with growing the brand, with growing with growing also the market share to a certain extent. But then obviously what we are trying to do to overcome this problem of not having many cars on the street right now is to give you this kind of on top service, to give you this hospitality with the Genesis 5-year care plan. And I'm not doing promotion here, don't get me wrong.
Please go ahead.
No, but I think this.
No, but these are concrete steps, of course.
I think those measures in giving something on top of the product to the customer, this is something that is helping to build up this relationship, this personal relationship with the customer, and that's a way of overcoming this issues, let's say, and these concerns of the European customers.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's kind of how it worked for me. Like I've had Hyundais, I've had several Hyundais, and that's kind of what it was. It was just, I think the warranty was amazing on it, but the first Hyundai I got, it was so much quality for what I paid for it.
Yeah.
And so I got another one. When it came time to get the next one, I think I had a lot of Elantras, you know what I mean? I really liked those cars. And compared to other vehicles, of that level, like I felt the value was there. And so it built up a trust, you know what I mean? And then eventually, I started to, make more money, I guess you could say. And I could get the better cars, and I went for the Genesis originally, but I always look at the lines that you have now with, some of the G70s and the G80s and those. And I think that those are the kind of vehicles that I look back, I see Hyundai is a brand that I can trust. And the vehicles that I've had in the past make me think, wow, I mean, what kind of value would I get from a luxury version of this? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree completely. Let's get to the future. Let's talk about all the hot topics that everyone likes to talk about nowadays on these car things. Like, let's talk about AI.
And not ChatGPT.
Yeah, not ChatGPT yet. Yeah. I mean, maybe you can get it if you want to. But I mean, what do you think about the implementation of like AI in car HMIs?
Well, we see that there is already a trend going into this direction, and we also have some first artificial intelligence on some Chinese OEMs entering the market, and I think it's an interesting approach in discovering things in developing the HMI maybe to a more natural way of interacting with the car. And I think this is also something we have seen over the past years on many manufacturers actually improving their voice assistant to a more natural speech, what people know from Google, from Siri. So I think this is the way, anyway, the whole world is kind of evolving to. So the car, as an essential part of many people's life, cannot take itself out from this future game. So I think it's an important step that we are doing improvement in those areas. But let's say my personal idea or feeling is that the AI still has to serve the customer, and we shouldn't have AI just for the purpose of having AI in the car.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't make the way we are interacting with the car not more complicated, but should make it easier for the customer. I mean, learning about the habits of the customer and then maybe suggesting things in a more easy way. For example, if the car recognizes that every morning in the winter when the temperature is below 5 degrees, I'm turning on the seat heating in the morning, the car could directly turn on the seat heating when I touch the door handle or something like this. So this is the kind of artificial intelligence I think could help in improving the customer experience on a car. But then just to have, let's say, the artificial intelligence for the purpose of having a gimmick, I think that's not the way, especially as a premium brand, you should go.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
At what point are we just going to stick a sticker on the car and be like, with AI on it or something?
Oh, you know that there are brands that already do that. So
Oh, really?
I don't want to call anyone out, but there are brands that already do that.
Well, I mean, when you speak about trust with these things, it's. I don't think there's people that don't trust AI right now. You know what I mean? So that could be the thing. I think that when you get to like the ADAS, the automated driving stuff like that, it's always a topic that I always like to talk about, just because I don't feel we are that close to fully autonomous driving. AI might help us get closer to it, but there's also like this trust issue where by the time you get into the first fully automated driving situation, you need to be really confident that that thing works. Because I don't like being a passenger in a car right now. Like I'm pretty bad at it. Like I'm that guy that's just like, turn here, no, stop, hit brake, all this stuff.
You and me both.
Yeah, because I have no control over the vehicle. So like fully autonomous, I would have to definitely be somebody who that has to be proven and all of that. So I think AI might get us there eventually, but yeah.
Absolutely. And when you think about also the generation of car buyers nowadays, we all want to be young and cool and so on and so on. And when you look at advertisements, you also see a lot of young people. But if we are honest with ourselves, the average car buyer in Europe is above 50. And I think that's quite important to understand that also this kind of technology can be quite overwhelming. So we are still quite young and we work in the industry. So sometimes I like to call ourselves the idiots of the industry. Not in a negative way, but when I'm looking at cars and when I'm sitting inside a car and talking to friends that are working in different industries, their approach of interacting with a vehicle, of touching materials, of looking at the cars is completely different than my way and the way we look at the cars in our industry. And I think that's something we always have to consider, also working in an automotive brand, to sometimes zoom out and to go back to the normal customer. For example, my father is driving a 7-year-old premium German car. And sometimes even today, when I'm coming home with one of the company cars, he's like really surprised what the car is able to do and what those kind of functions are doing and those kind of things. He's like asking, "Oh, how is this happening? How can I do this? This is crazy." So we shouldn't forget about the normal people out there, and I think that's quite important. To have this kind of, let's say, there will be a transition phase from having the cars we know from the past, the cars we know from nowadays, and then the cars of the future. So it will not be we switch on the artificial intelligence from today to tomorrow. The same with touchscreens, the same with all the connectivity inside the cars, all those kind of things. I think we are in an evolving phase, and as the development cycles of cars are obviously much longer than on smartphones, and also what we shouldn't forget is the amount of money you spend on a car is much more than what you spend on a smartphone. And even nowadays, I think more and more people tend to not upgrade their iPhone every year.
I don't.
Yeah.
They're already getting too expensive compared to a vehicle. That's a huge purchase. Yeah.
Of course. And I think I want to take it forward in the AI conversation a little bit, because Dominik, what you mentioned a little earlier was really music to my ears, because this is one of my key topics of interest, how AI influences user experience. And you mentioned something very interesting. You said that you spoke about how, when the temperature is below 5 degrees, the car should turn the heating on. And I think that is one place where the strength of AI lies. AI has the ability to understand, or rather the ability to perform actions based on context. And with that in tow, my question to you is, in your view, your personal view, what is some of the scope of AI implementation in cars, which takes into account normal people, like you said, like in your opinion?
Well, I didn't think so much yet about it, to be honest. But some of the things, I mentioned to you, and you took the example with the temperature. I think those kind of things can be pretty much. I don't know, I'm not a developer, but could be pretty much easy to be implemented. And I think those are the little first steps of the AI to be implemented in a more smooth way into cars, but also in our everyday life. And if you can surprise the customer to a certain way. And I think this is also something we can learn in the automotive industry from other industries, like from the smartphones. I can again take the example of the iPhone. So usually I'm setting my alarm on a regular basis for the working days. And one time, I don't know, I had vacation, I switched it off, and one Sunday, and the next day was even vacation, so I didn't need to turn on the alarm. But the iPhone was asking me, hey, didn't you forget to turn on your alarm? And this was surprising for me. Okay, it got me wrong in this moment in time, but at least it was, okay, the phone remembered I usually set my alarm. It was kind enough to remind me if I forgot it or not. Luckily, I had vacation the next week as well, but I was positively surprised about it, and I could still, let's say, deny the alarm being set. So the phone was not setting the alarm by itself. So I think we have to also consider that the interaction from us or from customers with the AI has to be a kind of dialogue and not in a certain way a dictatorship of the machine learning.
That makes a lot of sense.
I like how you said it was being kind and asking you. Yeah. Like for me, I get yelled at by my watch all the time. Like I'm not, it's time to stand up, please walk. I'm like, okay, yes. Like,
yeah. I mean, let's stay on the topic of the future and the future of mobility a little bit. At this point in time, battery electric vehicles are catching on. Like I said earlier, I'm a hydrogen enthusiast. Wherever it is going towards clean, silent, and let's say mostly electric mobility,
Right.
And Dominik, again, my question to you is, what can car manufacturers do to ease the experience, I'm not going to say user experience, of a person shifting from an ICE to an electric vehicle,
Oh yeah, when you talk about the regular people, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
the older generation, they have to make that transition from petrol to EV. Yeah. How do you ease them into that?
Well, obviously, it's quite challenging. It's quite challenging, even for someone that is very much deep down into the technology, into the industry. Changing from an ICE car, the way you used it in the past, changing to an electric car, obviously is a big challenge. But and it all starts one level above. So if you zoom out, everything starts from infrastructure. And this is obviously one of the most limiting factors at the moment, to see the infrastructure, not necessarily the public infrastructure, but especially here in Germany. If you see that more than 50% of the population is living for rent, and the ability of having a charger at home is quite limited. I'm living in a quite new building. It's 6 years old, and my landlord actually did basically the minimum he needs to do. So there are 100 underground parking spaces, and basically there are 4 wall boxes. I asked him if there would be a chance to install something more, if there would be chances to swap the parking lot to get an electric car. But no, there is absolutely no chance. And this is a building that is only 6 years old. But this for me is one of the biggest problems we are facing right now. Because with this, we could already overcome a lot of the challenges in everyday life situations with an electric car. But then on the other hand, if we go, of course, we have to be also dealing with those kind of things as an OEM. And I think it's quite important that you tackle this thing from different sides. So first of all, there is the technology itself. So I think we have to make sure that the efficiency of our car is improving, that the range is improving, not necessarily because of battery size, but because of having simply a better technology. Then also making the charging with technology as easy as possible, as fast as possible. I think that's also, again, one of the advantages we are having right now as a brand, also in terms of this change in the automotive industry. So what I said in the start is, to a certain extent, the automotive industry is reset to zero at the moment. And with technology being in the early steps, let's say, or in the early ages of developing, with having, for example, the 800-volt technology in our cars, being able to charge in about half of the time of the main competitions in the segment, I think it's a big advantage that has been given to us and that customers actually appreciate a lot. And then on the other hand, also the kind of infrastructure we are facing in Europe is super challenging, because we don't have one single provider for all those charge points, but there is 50, 100, 150 different providers of charge points. And I think this is something we have to deal with as well as a manufacturer.
That is very true. It brings to mind a very interesting story, because once Tom and I took one of our test vehicles out for a spin because we had to charge it. And I think we have tried, 7 or 8 chargers all around our office here in Stuttgart. Absolutely none of them work. You either need to have a unique subscription or the charger doesn't communicate with the car, or there was some or the other error, or charger is just not working, So I think you have a very valid point in that aspect that,
Infrastructure.
If being in the Motor Valley of Europe, literally Stuttgart, and not able to find a charger for an electric vehicle is a problem, it's definitely, I would assume, much bigger outside as well. And and of course, piggybacking onto that, Dominik, do you think the HMI plays an aspect in easing this transition? Do you think there is a role for the HMI to help, build the trust between a new EV owner / user and an EV? And do you think there is something that can be done?
That's for sure. That's for sure. Especially when we are talking about, let's say, the guidance of when to charge the car, how to charge the car. Also, only think about long distance traveling. It's a matter of fact that you have to change your behavior on how to drive an electric car if you want to achieve, let's say, a long distance in the most efficient way. Because with an ICE, driving pedal to the metal was never a big thing.
Yeah.
It actually meant, okay, you have to fuel probably for 50 euros more, but necessarily as a premium customer, this is not the main criteria that bothers you. But with electric cars, the parameters obviously are not only money, but it's also time. And this is something very precious in nowadays. So I think that's something the customer, first of all, has to learn, but we can support him in doing this kind of transition and having a very natural HMI, also interacting with the way it's showing charging stops. It's giving you guidance on long distance travel, in suggesting automatic charging stops and saying, hey, look, if you drive 130, you will be able to make it to your destination within this time. You charge one time in between where you probably anyway have to go quickly to the toilet, whatever. So I think in this way, the interaction with the car is becoming more natural, and also this transition somehow, those charging stops that usually are considered from all of the customers as a pain in the ass, they are becoming kind of a way of interacting with the car if the HMI is solving it in a very natural way, in a very elegant way.
Yeah, it's cool because you talked about, taking older generation people. Is that the best way to say that? Yeah. You take older car guys out and they start to look at some of the HMI that's up there, and they're just, hey, wow, how is this doing this? How is that doing that? I feel like there are ways to wow them and ease that transition a bit. You know what I mean? The more you do that. And you talked earlier about the architecture-inspired kind of design that's inside some of the Genesis vehicles, the wide space. What are some other things that Genesis might be doing to help them stand apart from the competition when it comes to visual and experience design?
So first of all, I think design is an essential part of the DNA of Genesis, and where we are very proud of doing things in a certain way and having a kind of design philosophy and design identity on all of our cars. And obviously, in the transition phase, the design will evolve, and I think we can already see a glimpse of that with the GV60 being launched last year. So it's differently enough to be recognized as a new kind of vehicle that came to the market, but then on the other hand is also similar enough to be recognized clearly as a Genesis. And I think this is something that will also, when looking at some of the future designs with our Korean colleagues, this is also something that will be kept for the future. And I think that's quite important, to have elements that will go through the brand through the years. And this is, I think, something that we can learn from other European OEMs especially, because if you look at some BMWs from the 1930s, 1940s, you will still see it's a BMW because you have the kidneys in the car. And I think this is something that also a lot of Asian manufacturers kind of failed in Europe, because they changed too much of their design from generation to generation. And it might be something that is appreciated in the Asian markets, maybe also in the US market, but definitely for us in Europe is something that is not, let's say, at least not valued. It's more saying, okay, it's inconsistency, and this is something we Europeans usually don't appreciate. And I think this is a lesson learned that actually Genesis is taking into consideration, and we are, let's say, having a helping hand, as our chief designer is a European person. So probably this kind of thinking is implemented into the brand already from the very early stage. And that's highly important, I think, to keep a kind of consistency, also to, again, we're coming back to the topic of trust, to build up trust into the brand. Because if I'm changing design from day one to day two, then people might also question, maybe my car wasn't as good as I thought. That's why they changed completely the design.
That's very true.
Yeah. I mean, so with the advent of like Apple CarPlay, this is weird. It's like a 180. Should have segued into this better. But I mean, really, I guess you could say, there's some people are getting rid of Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which may be seen as inconsistent in a way.
Yeah.
But I mean, with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto and the Apple announcing much deeper integration with the phone kind of becomes the HMI of the user sometimes. Like, what do you think is the solution to that? I mean, how can OEMs compel users to use their HMIs and not give further data to like Apple and Google? Like, what's Genesis doing with their system in this regard?
So, I mean, I think it's a two-sided thing, right? So on the one hand, I'm seeing the side of an OEM. On the other hand, I'm seeing also the side of the customers. And that's the two things. So being a product manager, being now the head of product management, I think, and I'm always coming back to one sentence, one of my professors in university always told me, and the product manager has to be the advocate of the customer inside their own company. And this is what I'm still trying to achieve in my everyday job, in my everyday business, to always listen to the customer and what they really want. Because in the end, we as an OEM, we have an interest, but we are not making the car for ourselves. And Apple CarPlay, I think, is a good example for that. Because simply this is what customers are demanding. And this is what customers would like to have integrated into the car, at least to have the flexibility of using Apple CarPlay. And I'm a big fan of the system myself. So I'm not using it every day, But if I would like to listen to favorite things, if I would like to have the, let's say, the easy approach of accessing my smartphone when I need to while driving, for instance, using WhatsApp is super easy with CarPlay. I'm using the audio control. I can send messages still to some friends, at least some urgent messages. And this, I think, this you can only achieve with this integration of the smartphone into the car. So this kind of technology, to develop it for an OEM, to bring it inside the car in the same level of quality, I personally believe is not something we should aim for, but is also very hard to achieve. And also to compete with a device that you are using every day 8 hours is super hard. Because none of us is driving a car every day for 8 hours and is interacting with the car infotainment system 8 hours a day. So I think the integration to a certain level has to be there. And then on the other hand, I think the HMI of ourself, of the car, has to be as easy as possible again, to not overwhelm the customer. And I think this is something we can learn from the kind of new tech companies that are coming onto the market, like Tesla did 10 years ago. There is also now NIO, for example, as an example. They are using also this simplified approach and in clustering their HMI in a more, let's say, smartphone tablet way. I'm not saying it's 100% right, but it's definitely an approach of bringing the two systems more close to each other and making the usage from both devices as easy as possible for the customer. But on the other hand, I think we cannot deny that customers are using an Android or an iPhone every day. And this is something we simply cannot compete with.
It begs the question, is the car ever going to become like a phone item or a gadget in your pocket kind of thing, like another e-device that we use? I mean, besides price point, right?
I mean, BMW has a key with a touchscreen that you need to charge. We are slowly getting there.
Well, if the car is becoming a device, I think it depends on first of all the clients, the customers, but then also on how we design cars, how we make cars. And I think there will be cars that will definitely go into this area of becoming more like a device, like a commuter from A to B. And this is but this is actually not a trend that is very new to the industry. There has always been cars that were basically serving the need of going from A to B. And on the other hand, we always had cars in the industry that were serving, okay, you can also go from A to B, but definitely is serving also another need for creating emotions, expressing your personality, enjoying the lifestyle. I mean, a Cabrio is definitely, so to say, it might be seen as a useless car for many people. But being in France at the sea, being in Croatia at the sea, being in Italy, in Tuscany, driving around in a Cabrio on a nice spring morning, I think there is it's not a bad way of enjoying life.
La dolce vita, as they say.
Yeah, there's definitely that. Yeah.
So I think this trend has been always there, and I think we will keep this kind of trend also in the future. So yeah, some of the cars with less emotions, they will become more like a device. They will become more like a thing that is commuting you from A to B. But especially when you go up in the market to the premium, to the luxury brands, a car will always stay a car and will always create a certain kind of emotion to the owner, to the one that is using the car.
Yeah, it's always interesting. I live in Europe now. I lived in the States for my whole life. And to see the difference in the kinds of cars on the road, like I was from Austin, Texas, and there is nothing but really giant pickup trucks. I mean, just everywhere. I mean, you have to basically get a new mortgage to put gas in it. But the thing is you come here and that's just not practical. Like here, you wouldn't really see a lot of like smart cars or short, small vehicles in Austin, Texas. But you try to park a pickup truck here in Stuttgart, like good luck.
Good luck, yeah.
Like, it's not happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think then I would like to bring a point that you mentioned in the past, and then because you just mentioned about Neo and Tesla and their kind of new tablet approach, and I would like to tie two things together. So earlier you mentioned that about persistence in the market to build trust, that you need to be in a place over time where you're building trust with people slowly, and I resonate with that school of thought. But let me take that Neo connection back and look at Chinese OEMs. Chinese OEMs, on the other hand, have a very aggressive approach. Like they're like, this is the latest tech that you can find. It has a 25-inch touchscreen inside the car, and you can recline the seat to 60-degree angle. I mean, I'm not making fun of it. That's really how it is like.
The whole car is just a touch screen, everything you can touch.
Exactly. And then their approach is so aggressive. They're very aggressive, like build fast, fail fast. So, Dominik, I mean, before we go towards the end of this, my question is, what approach do you think is better? Like, do you think it makes sense to like come up and put all the latest technology in a car and be really aggressive in pushing and marketing your car? Or do you think it makes more sense to like take time to build trust with people?
Or do the harmony thing that you're speaking of, you know what I mean? Where you have a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to distinguish between, let's say, also the approach of the brand itself. So there is always, I think, a different approach, mainstream versus premium.
That's true.
And especially, I think, for a premium brand, and also this is the approach we are trying to push from a European side towards headquarter in Korea, is always quality versus quantity. So to not have a feature just to tick the box, but if we have the feature, it has to fulfill a certain customer expectation. It has to serve a certain need, and it has to be on a premium level so that the customer actually is not, let's say, overwhelmed by the technology, is maybe pissed off by a function that is there, but is not working 100% properly. So for me, I consider myself as a technology loving person, but the thing I hate most is if I get a feature and then the feature is not working, or is not working to a certain quality level. Then I'm saying, okay, but why do I need the feature if it's not working? And for me, again, the best example is coming from another industry. There is also, I know it's a let's say it's a battle that has been there since the smartphone world has been established, is Android versus Apple.
Right, yeah.
And I was, actually, I have to admit, I was never an Apple fan in the start. I didn't like their approach. I didn't like the mentality people tended to have an Apple iPhone. And I was always an Android user. But one day I actually tried an iPhone, and I was convinced at that moment in time that the technology is actually better. Even though on a spec paper, the iPhone was still, let's say, the same as an Android phone from one generation before. But from how the technology worked and how the interaction of the system of all the different apps is, simply amazed me. And this is what made me think, okay, now I understand why Apple actually can claim that they are premium and some of the Android phones might not be. Yeah, from a spec point of view, they are much better, but from how the phone interacts with you as a customer is much worse.
Yeah, I was the same way. Same way.
I think this, and I think this is the same for cars. If you just put features there randomly to just tick the box, I think it's not helping the overall, first of all, brand perception. It's not helping to build up trust if we go back to the previous topic. And then on the other hand, it's also not fulfilling a certain expectation that you're raising with your design, with how the models are positioned, with the communication you are doing on the models. So I think everything, especially in a premium world, has to be 360 degree. We cannot only tick the box and having the feature and having the spec list, but then if we say we are convinced that this feature is helpful and is helping our customers, then we have to make sure that it's working 100% right.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, that's how it was for me too. I had an Android because on paper, you're right. It looks like, okay, I can customize this. I can add storage. I can do all of these things. Yeah. But then, the first time I had an iPhone, it just worked. and
Yes.
it actually worked with my other devices. You can get to an Apple and PC thing where you can say there's technically a PC is just more upgradable. You can change things, you can make it your own, but it just doesn't work as good as my MacBook does. Like everything works correctly like it's supposed to. And yeah, I can totally see that with the vehicles as well. Just do the things that do work. Don't just put them there just because. You know what I mean? Quality over quantity. I like that.
And I think that's a good segue into my next question. So it's a very interesting discussion that we're having about implementation being the best. It's always the quality over the quantity, like you said.
Yeah, you see a lot of those. It screens, we look at every HMI system imaginable. And Srivas has seen a ton of things that do work well and things that don't.
That don't, yeah. And you spoke about multiple device integration. So, Dominik, do you think that we could apply the same for cars? Of course, today we see cars with these mobile apps where you can already turn on the AC and so on, which is rather convenient. Before it's quite good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, do you think we can go beyond this in building a multi-device, let's say, seamless experience for automobiles?
Not sure. Not sure if I got the question.
What I mean is that so in case let's take the case of Apple, right? You have a laptop, you have a smartphone, you have a whatever watch, earbuds, etc. Where I'm getting at is, do you think we can do the same kind of approach with cars, where
like your car would integrate with your watch? Yeah,
exactly. Your watch can be a key for it. Your smartphone is already sometimes a key for it. You have apps. Even using smart home assistants to control the cars. Do you think this kind of an approach makes sense, where you're like you have a multi-device connection so that the experience is very seamless?
Yeah, I think we could do it, right? Like it's more of like how.
Yeah, I think the trend is already there, and we are moving into this direction. I mean, on GV60 with the new model year, we introduced the digital key, so now basically your smartphone can be the key to the car. There are the apps that are connected to the car, and you can do certain things from your device on the car itself. So I think that the trend is already there, and I think it's also a phase of discovering right now, of trying new things. You mentioned the BMW key some time ago with the display. So I think there are certain ways of exploring this kind of way to the future, but also, again, I think it's quite complicated to achieve what we are achieving on smartphones right now, because still the life cycle of those devices is still much smaller than a car. And what will become more important, I think, also more from a personal opinion than a company opinion, but the car needs to stay upgradable. So I think the hardware needs to be upgradable, the software needs to be upgradable. And I think this is something more people would like to see, that their car is updated over the time and actually not staying stupid, let's say. So you buy the car in 2020 and then it stays stupid until 2030. I think what customers are expecting more and more is that their car is becoming not a device like a smartphone, but it's becoming more smart, let's say. And I'm not saying it has to be connected, it has to be autonomous driving, but simply it has to be updated. So that the customer is able to also have, I don't know, a new infotainment screen after 5 years, to have maybe upgrades on the other systems after 10 years, if the manufacturer is still working on improvements. Those kind of things, I think, are getting much more important than actually making, let's say, the car or seeing the car as a device only. Of course, there needs to be a certain interaction with the car between the different devices you are using. But for me, more important actually is that the car itself is becoming more smart and more upgradable in the future.
Yeah.
I mean, also bringing it, maybe if we zoom out, is a trend that we see in the whole environment or in the whole population, right? I mean, efficiency, economical friendly lifestyle is becoming more popular, but then this should also somehow go into the car itself and making the car more, let's say, upgradable and making it also fit for the future in 5 years is probably the most sustainable way we can do it.
That is very true.
Beside everybody changing to electric cars.
Of course. And I think you raise a very important point about upgradability here, because this was the norm, in my view, in cars even a decade ago, because we had a car which was a Hyundai, and then the infotainment system didn't have an auxiliary one. We upgraded it. So we didn't have to, feel like, oh, this car is a bit of a hassle. We can't really use our smartphone with the car. But when I look at the HMI systems today, let's take Android automotive integration, so to speak. I look at this like a smartphone. A smartphone is updated for 2 years and then its life is done, So I bring this up in a way of asking, Dominik, in your view, what are some concrete steps that we can take to ensure that the upgradability of the car stays? Because my personal opinion is that upgradability of cars is going down slowly.
Oh, really? Yeah. Kind of like when you do have a cell phone, sometimes, as the generations go, you end up with software updates that render the old generation just like a brick. Like it just runs incredibly slowly and all of that. Like how do you
and you run the risk of that happening to cars. So the question is, how can we ensure that cars remain upgradable?
Wow, tricky one. And I think it's especially is also very, very hard to answer. Not sure if there is a right or wrong answer at this moment in time.
Anything that's.
But also, it's interesting that you're saying that actually you believe that cars are getting less and less upgradable. Because actually, my feeling from working inside the automotive and benchmarking also different kind of competitors is that this kind of upgradable infotainment, but still also now going deeper into the car architecture, like having different suspension settings, having a different steering ratio, whatever, is becoming more and more popular. And we see those examples today in some of the cars that have features on demand, that have certain ways of upgrading the infotainment.
Yeah.
Of course, hardware is a topic.
Yes.
But then we are also coming to one point, I think, that we shouldn't forget. Cars already got very expensive in the last few years. Yeah. And if you try to, let's say, make the car also, let's say from a hardware perspective, able to handle a software from 2050, it's probably the ratio between cost and hardware to put inside the car is probably out of any scope.
Yeah,
and
you can't really future-proof the car necessarily. You know what I mean?
So
not too far out anyway.
What we can do is, to a certain extent, to play with the boundaries we are having, and this obviously is always a triangle of technology, cost, and making a thing future-proof. And I think in this way, you have to balance also the different factors, and also we shouldn't forget, software for the customer seems to be a cheap thing, but nevertheless there is a lot of development behind, there is a lot of resources behind. A software upgrade is not coming for free, so to say.
It's the natural evolution of the car as a piece of technology rather than just something you drive. Like we see that a lot. And you mentioned Tesla in the past. Now instead of having a traditional console, it's kind of just like a big iPad in the middle there. But you get frequent updates on these type of things. You get the OTAs. You get these different software packages. So I mean, this is where it's going, and I feel like this is where the future's headed. At least my personal opinion. I don't know if we go back in any way, but
you never know. I think like Dominik said, you try these things. This is a period where you're trying all these new things. You try it over time. You realize that okay, this hardware now doesn't support the software after 5 years.
Yeah,
and then you realize this is probably not the right direction that we have to take.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Dominik, on the transition, like you talked about earlier. When it comes to these things, it's not going, AI is not going to just happen overnight. It's got to be these incremental steps. Sure. So what I think Genesis is doing when you talk about putting physical knobs, keeping those in, that kind of incremental transition is key and vital to, bringing people along with you.
Yeah. And that brings me to my final question, because we've spoken so much about technology. We spoke about AI, touchscreens, Android Automotive.
It is a cars and tech podcast. We do that.
That's true. That's true. But I think Dominik raised a very interesting point earlier about AI for the sake of AI, or features for the sake of features, is not a good idea. And that brings me to the point of saturation of technology, right? So saturation of technology is a point when, you've reached a point where adding unnecessary elements, you're adding things just to stay ahead of the competition. So
ticking boxes.
Yeah, ticking boxes, exactly. So since we spoke about that often, Dominik, as my final question, what is your view of saturation of technology in today's car HMIs? Like, where do you think, as a person who's a product manager, OEMs or companies in general should draw a line and stop adding more and more features just for the sake of it?
Well, also here I think is a question I cannot answer for the company right now, but it's more on a personal, let's say, feeling on what we see in our everyday life, and I think to a certain extent we reached a point where the saturation of tech inside the cars has reached a level where I would say, from what the car is supposed to be, at least serving also a person that is still willing to drive a car by himself or by herself, is at a level where this is enough, let's say. Then, of course, if we are going to car concepts in the future where you will have, I don't know, fully autonomous people mover and so on, then, of course, you can also play the HMI game or the technology game in a different way. But I think to a car that is still meant to be driven by yourself, I think the technology has reached already a certain level that is already very, very high. So now we can talk about flavors here and flavors there. But overall, I think the technology level has reached a level where I would say, me as a driver, I don't need more than what is inside the car today.
Okay, thank you so much. That's the show. Dominik Kling, Head of Product Management, Genesis Motor Europe. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome, and thanks again also for the invitation. I hope it was also enjoyable from your side.
Thank you so much. You can listen to the podcast on all the platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, and also on YouTube at The Screens Podcast and at screensauto.com. For everybody, I'm Matt. This is Shrivas. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Have a good one.
Thank you.